Welcome to lecture number 64, historical topic 6.10, the development of the middle class, and the theme for today is social structures because it's an economic hierarchy that we're describing. The learning objective is explain the socioeconomic continuities and changes associated with the growth of industrial capitalism from 1865 to 1898. The first of two key concepts is broken up into two parts. The first part says corporations' need for managers and for male and female clerical workers, as well as increased access to educational institutions, fostered the growth of a distinctive middle class. A big change for this period is the growth of white-collar work. As more factories hire more workers, they're going to need a managerial class to oversee the workers and make sure that they're doing their job correctly. These jobs paid more money, and so those who filled them will have more disposable income as a result. Women begin to fill jobs previously filled by men as clerical workers and secretaries. The fields in which they become a majority of the labor force often lose status and wages. For example, teachers and nursing, fields in which women make up a majority of the labor force, end up being associated with the lower social status of women and are therefore less valued and end up having less pay. Education is being expanded through the growth of public high schools and state universities that are being paid for by the Morrill Land Grant Act. The act was passed during the Civil War in 1862 in the previous period, but it gets renewed in 1880. These state colleges provide an affordable education for people inside of those states and normally focus on trade or agricultural fields. For example, Virginia Tech and Texas A&M started as land-grant colleges and focused on agricultural and mechanics. That's what the A&M stands for in Texas A&M. Other types of schools on the rise are women's colleges. There's a huge growth in women's private colleges, for example, Smith College, Bryn Mawr, Mount Holyoke. And of course, historically black colleges and universities had already been founded earlier in the 19th century, starting in 1837. But in the late 19th century, there's a larger growth of HBCUs. For some HBCUs, their original intent was for them to train people who were going to become preachers in certain denominations. Other times they were established as trade schools like Tuskegee Institute, established by Booker T. Washington. Some of the other prominent HBCUs include Morehouse College, Howard University, and Fisk University. The middle class began to migrate out of the suburbs because the conditions in the cities were often crowded, unhygienic, and dirty. The suburbs provided a cleaner, more spacious alternative. The land in the suburbs was at a lower cost. Often, the suburban houses could be built with wood and make them look nicer. Wood construction was something that was slowly being phased out in the inner cities because of major fire events. For example, the city of Chicago experienced a major fire in 1871 that left about 100,000 people homeless. But outside of the city in the suburbs, they were allowed to build wooden homes and could be spaced out further apart to keep large fires from spreading through an entire community. There were also new commuting options for people who lived in the suburbs. Rail cars could reach all the way out to the suburbs, so there was no loss of contact with the city center. The second part of the key concept says, a growing amount of leisure time also helped expand consumer culture. The growth of newspapers and periodicals is seen in the rise of the Hearst and the Pulitzer newspapers. Their circulation reaches the majority of Americans, and because they're all reading the same newspapers, they're being exposed to the same information, and more importantly, they're being exposed to the same advertisements. Advertisements were what was driving the huge circulation of newspapers and magazines. People were buying the same products, creating a uniquely American consumer culture. For amusements, they would go to traveling circuses. The Barnum, Bailey, Ringling Brothers Circus starts touring during this time. There's also variety shows like vaudevilles. Vaudevilles are traditional variety shows that include musical acts, comedy acts, and often had some actors dressed up in blackface. One of the common characters in vaudeville across the country was Jim Crow. Jim Crow was always a black character played by a white actor dressed up in blackface, portraying a black man in an exaggerated way that would play on the negative stereotypes that people held about black Americans. The character's name is adopted by the segregatory laws that are passed in this historical period. Buffalo Bill's Wild West was another type of variety show that would play on the stereotypes and mythical views that people held about the American West. William Cody, or Buffalo Bill, would travel around with Native Americans, actual buffalo and horses, and he would put on a cowboy and Indians type of show and reenactments of battles between natives and the U.S. government. It reiterated negative stereotypes of American Indians, and the perception that Americans have of cowboys and Indians is largely due to the success of Buffalo Bill's Wild West variety show. During this period, there's also the rise of popular music. Ragtime is a new style of music exemplified by the songs of Scott Joplin, like The Entertainer. The publishing company sells over 1 million copies of the sheet music to his Maple Leaf Rag. In New Orleans, Jelly Roll Morton helps develop jazz, and the blues are also another popular form of music that is developed in the state of Louisiana and the city of New Orleans. In this section, Black Americans make big contributions to the amusement of Americans at the end of the century. Finally, there is the rise of spectator sports. Professional baseball is organized, and the Cincinnati Red Stockings, seen in the top middle of the screen, are the first Major League Baseball team. Initially, there was no official segregatory policy in baseball. However, only few black players played on teams, and there was no majority black teams allowed in the league. The official color line in baseball was put in place in 1887 after several incidents in which the player and manager from the Chicago White Stockings, now the Chicago Cubs franchise, threatened to not play against teams with black players in them. College football also becomes popular, and first dominated by schools in the Northeast. Later on, in the early 20th century, it will become more of a national phenomenon where people follow the powerhouse schools like the Ivies or the military academies. The final key concept says, some business leaders argued that the wealthy had a moral obligation to help the less fortunate improve society, as articulated in the idea known as the gospel of wealth, and they made philanthropic contributions that enhance educational opportunities in urban environments. The Gospel of Wealth came from an essay that Andrew Carnegie wrote about the responsibility of the wealthy to give back to society and to engage in philanthropic causes. But he's also making a judgment on the tax system of the United States. In his view, it is much more useful for the mega-rich class of Americans to give money to philanthropic causes like libraries, performance halls, schools, to help lower classes succeed in this capitalist system, as opposed to giving it to the government in the form of taxes that would then be redistributed to the lower classes. In his mind, he could help society better than the government could. He put his money where his mouth was, and he gave away more than $350 million to libraries, universities, and concert halls. If you do a quick Google search of Carnegie Library, you see that there are Carnegie libraries across the country in big cities and small towns. He also donated to libraries that were in his native Scotland and as far as New Zealand. There's also Carnegie Mellon University, and as shown on the screen, Carnegie Hall, the famous performance hall. Finally, here's the recap. The middle class did expand despite the growing gap between the rich and the poor in the Gilded Age. It was due to the evolving economy, increased educational opportunities. Members of the middle class often moved to the suburbs, and new amusement opportunities like circuses, sports, variety shows became popular with the growth of leisure time. Finally, Carnegie encouraged those who were wealthy to engage in philanthropy. Thank you for watching. If you would like to watch the next lecture, you can click on the video link on the screen, and if you're looking for more practice to help you on the AP exam, you can visit apushslides.com. I wish you the very best in all of your studying and look forward to seeing you back on the next lecture.